Tariq Ali, who among many others has written the introduction to a book of Fidel Castro's speeches. And we're also joined by Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Peter, do you think that, just picking up from that kind of revolutionary in the hills, do you think that did shape the kind of romantic love for the man in the years after?
People wanted to believe it. Much of it was a myth from the start. Batista was really overthrown by the Americans, who withdrew arms supplies from him and then told him quite clearly that he had to quit, and engineered what was effectively a military putsch against him. Castro simply moved into the vacuum that was left by Batista's collapse. And the interesting thing about that is how pitifully small Castro's band of guerrillas turns out to have been. And we now have actual warrant for that. And yet he uses expressions such as Moses coming down from the mountain. Well, what comes over people? Like say, it's debutantes swooning over big hairy men. It's pathetic. Why do people want to swoon over
well, he was a young guy, and it
is just one of those strange things which people seem to want, to
Ali,
believe in great leaders and great men.
You were a swooner, weren't you? You definitely swooned. Can I read you some stuff? You put a letter, your name to a letter in The Guardian about 11 years ago. There has been not a single case of disappearance, torture, or extrajudicial execution since 1959 in Cuba. Is that really true?
Well, those were the figures we obtained before I signed that letter. But instead of starting on that, why don't we start with what Cuba was before the revolution? It was effectively an American brothel, run by the mafia, seen as an American colony, and the Cuban revolutionaries, partially because the Americans withdrew support from the dictator, organized more and more support. It wasn't just 200 people. The July the 26th movement became a huge mass movement and got rid of that. And the reason for the support Castro enjoyed was largely because people didn't want to go back being what they were, an American colony. Right. So that is the key thing to understand.
So like all revolutions, they kill the one king, and then they have to build something in its place. And we're judging whether they built something good in its place.
They didn't want to become a Soviet colony. None of them had any idea that was going to happen. Castro pretended or genuinely said, and we still don't really know what the truth is, that he wasn't a communist and that he wasn't going to do this. And yet very, very quickly they became a Soviet colony. And they became a Soviet colony in which opposition to Castro was treated with the most extraordinary brutality. It may be that, that people didn't officially disappear, but I have to say they were certainly tortured. Hugo Matos, who was one of Castro's original comrades and very much a strong opponent of Batista, when he said to Castro, "I don't support your turn towards Soviet communism," Castro threw him into prison for 20 years, 16 of them in solitary confinement, and arranged for him to be tortured. Matos' own account of this... I have to finish there because the torture issues here. Matos' own account of this says that his genitals were pierced during his imprisonment. Now, if that's not torture, I don't know what is.
Do you accept broadly that it was awful, that there was extended solitary confinement, denial of medical care to sick people, summary trials, labour camps, gay people sent for re-education to camps?
Well, hang on, one at a time.
Right.
Well, why one at a time?
Well, I mean, in a sense, they go together or they don't.
Well, no, I don't deny that. No, and I think the way gay people were treated was appalling, and I think the way in which political prisoners at that time were treated was not great either.
But if Mike Pence did that in the United States, you know, if Mike Pence in Indiana had been sending... Maybe you would be the first complaining and protesting, wouldn't you, and saying this man is a monster?
Yeah, but I would also see which side I'm on. I'm not on the... Yes, of course. Yes, right. I was on the side and am on the side of what the best things that revolution has done. I don't deny that at all. Of course it's not flawless. They made huge number of mistakes, and many of them admit it, and it wasn't... They never pretended they were a democracy. It was essentially a revolutionary dictatorship. I would say that these dictatorships are social dictatorships, which do a great deal for their people on health, on education.
But you just admitted all this stuff.
Hang on a second. Look, here's first of all, Castro did talk about representative democracy when he first came into Havana, and then he simply, I think he said Urrutia was an elected president at one point. But so he did say that. He did make promises of that kind. Most people believe that he would be actually running a freer government than the Batista government. In fact, it was worse than that.
Peter, you're going over the top. It was not worse than that. If it had been worse than that, he would have been toppled. And when the Americans invaded him at the Bay of Pigs, why wasn't there a mass uprising, which the Cuban emigres had promised the Americans? Mass uprising.
There's a huge difference between being discontented by a regime and taking part in a mass uprising. The point about you, Tariq, is you're an intelligent, generous, thoughtful person with a sense of humour and a sense of proportion, but you will not make the step of saying, look, whatever good this regime may or may not have done, and I have to say it's questionable whether it did.
Any good at all? You don't believe it did any good?
I say it's questionable whether, but I haven't finished the question I was going to ask you, as you well,
very briefly,
as you well know. The actions of Castro towards his opposition were indefensible. Torture, forcing people to eat their own excrement, locking people up for 20 years for disagreeing with him.
I want Tariq to have
within the bounds of civilised behaviour.
Time to answer. Because Pinochet did a lot of those things, and you don't say, well, for all his faults.
Pinochet wiped out 30,000 people, for God's sake. How can you compare Pinochet to Castro? But why did you mention Pinochet?
Because it's about which
government supported Pinochet.
But is it because it's the side you're on that dictates? You're willing to forgive all the stuff that you admitted
I'm saying that the Cuban Revolution...
There are people who say the same about Pinochet, isn't it? Well, he managed to develop...
No, I don't think people say exactly... Even Pinochet's admirers don't say the same things about him, by the way. They now accept what he did, and Chile is doing what it's doing to obliterate that legacy, which was backed by the West. But why can't you just recognise...
This enormous rage you get into about Pinochet's killing, but what about Castro's judicial murders, the show trials, the shootings, the repeated firing squads at the La Cabana during the first months of his time in power? Utterly lawless.
Tariq, you must have the last word. Give Tariq the last word. I want Tariq to have the last word.
Made a revolution. The Cubans made a revolution. The Americans tried to stop it. The Americans punished them for nationalizing all the big American companies and liberating their country socially and economically. That they made mistakes, we know. But you know, the mistakes made by people, huge dictators in South America and elsewhere, who backed by the United States.
You use the word mistakes were made in a sort of passive way. These were things that were worse than anything the United States.
Look, the worst of anything recently, the worst of anything recently has been the torture at Guantanamo, which is based in Cuba, and that torture has been carried out by who?
I'm just saying. What use is that as an argument? The point is, you object to it quite rightly, because quite rightly.
No, I object to whoever tortures.
You object to all torture.
Yes.
But you don't actually seem to object to it half so much when Castro does.
No, I object to it.
That seems to me to be a lack
this is
of
not
perspective.
I object to it, but I say when discussing the Cuban Revolution, one has to discuss a great deal and not be completely captured by ideology.
Is there anything that excuses torture?
No.
Right. Well, then why do you excuse it when Castro does it?
We need to leave it there, gents. Thanks both very much. Fascinating. And straight after